set of sessions for Key Stage 1 and 2 children every Monday at 11, and we're going to be here for 5 weeks, and we're going to be looking at the Stone Age and the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, and we're going to be looking at how our society developed. Now, the reason that we're doing that is because last term we looked at scientists and inventors, and lots of you were really interested in Mary Leakey and her work that she did on understanding how humans evolved and developed. And so we're going to kind of take that story and move it on that little bit further and look at the Stone Age and the Iron Age and the Bronze Age. And also it goes really, really well with those of you that are doing our book study on a Friday. So let's get going. As always, we're going to be looking at lots of skills along the way, because it's not just about cramming yourself with knowledge, and it's about doing it at your own pace. So hello everybody I can see who's watching live, and everybody who is over on YouTube as well, and everybody also who is watching on catch up. If you're watching on Facebook, do feel free to post some comments, even if you're watching on catch up, so that you can feel part of the lesson. And let's get going. So today what we're going to be looking at is lots of different things, but the main focus is how did people survive during the Stone Age? So we're going to look at what the Stone Age was like and how people actually survived. Now, when you talk about the Stone Age or the Bronze Age or the Iron Age, you tend to use the term prehistoric. Now, does anybody know what the term prehistoric means? That's our very first pause for thought. So I'm going to give you 20 seconds to have a little think. What does prehistoric mean? So lots of really great thinking going on. So when you look at the word prehistoric, you're seeing pre. So what does pre mean? Well, pre kind of means before, doesn't it? And then historic or history. So whenever we talk about history or something that's historic, we're talking about studying the past. So history is the study of the past. But when we use the term prehistory, we're talking about any time before there were written records. So prehistory is a time where people were living, but they weren't making any sort of written records. So if you've done the Egyptians, for example, you would know that the Egyptians, they wrote things down. If you've looked at the Romans wrote things down. But when we talk about prehistory, we're talking about all of that period of time before we started to make written records. And the reason that we make that is because our understanding of that period of time has to primarily come from archaeological evidence, so evidence that we can dig out of the ground, because we cannot read anything from the time because there is no written records. Now, different areas across the world developed in different periods of time. So prehistory, if you're looking at chronologically, prehistory, that kind of cutoff from when we move from being prehistoric to writing and recording is different for different areas and different civilizations. And in fact, there are some civilizations that still don't keep written records. So there's lots of tribes in the Amazon, for example, that we don't even know about, that we have no knowledge about. They still are living that sort of existence. And so prehistoric means a civilization that doesn't have writing. So what you might want to think about is, what would you like to find out about prehistoric times? It might be about what they ate. It might be about what they wore. It might be about how they organized their society. It might be about what their houses were like. It might be about lots and lots of things. But it's always a good idea to start having in your head all the things that you'd like to develop and work on, because these lessons afterwards, you might use these as a springboard to learning more about this period of time. Now, what we're going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at a particular period of prehistory. We're going to be looking at the Stone Age. That's what we're going to start looking at, because prehistory goes back millions and millions of years, and we don't have time to do all of it. We're going to be just looking at the Stone Age to start with. And the Stone Age, chronologically, so you can get it in your head, this is a time when we have these early humans living on Earth. So this is millions of years after after dinosaurs have become extinct. I know that sometimes when you look at children's books, particularly books for little ones, you sometimes see humans living alongside dinosaurs. And although that's fun, it's historically inaccurate. So we're looking at around about 2.5 million years ago was when the Stone Age began, and it ended roughly around 3000 to 2400 BC. And the reason that we kind of click that link on it is because that's when you're getting around about the time that the Egyptians were in existence. And as I said, the Egyptians, for most areas around the world, kind of experienced the end of end of prehistoric times, because most civilizations start to create human written records. Tell I've had a week off, can't get my words out. Now, in Britain, the Stone Age began about 800,000 years ago, although we have lots of evidence of early humans living in other parts of the world. So if you did Mary Leakey with me, for example, we know that most of her evidence that she found about early humans was found in Africa. Now, there was definitely prehistoric and Stone Age people were all around the world a lot earlier than 800,000 BC. But when you're looking at Britain and prehistoric Britain and Stone Age Britain, it's roughly around 800,000 years ago. And so if we think about when we end the prehistoric times, we tend to decide that the prehistoric times in Britain ended when the Romans invaded, because they were the first civilization. We didn't have anything to do with the Egyptians over in Britain, but it was the first civilization to invade Britain and bring with it written records. So that's when we tend to decide in Britain that the Stone Age ended. And so that's what we're really going to be looking at today. Now, the Stone Age, we tend to find each part has its own name. So we have the Paleolithic, and we have the Mesolithic, and we have the Neolithic. So those particular times. So we tend to split the Stone Age into Old and Middle and the New Stone Age, and we tend to use the terms Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic. Okay. So, during the Stone Age, the climate of the Earth changed an awful lot. And there were times when it was really cold, and there was times when the climate was warmer. And Britain at that time was joined to the rest of Europe. So we had hippos in our rivers, we potentially had lions prowling the land. And this is due to this particular map. So what I'd like you to do, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to have a look at it. I want you to have a look what you think this shows you. And it also has a really interesting thing. It talks about something called Doggerland. So what do you think Doggerland is? What do you think the green is showing you? I'm going to give you 30 seconds, lots of you are great geographers, to read the map and have a go and work out what you think it shows you. Some really great answers, some really great answers. So what you're looking at is you're looking at the green, and what the green is where they think that land used to be. So people could move and walk in theory freely from France, for example, over to what we now know as England. And so this area is now used by archaeologists and historians. They use the word Doggerland to refer to this area. And you could go and look up, there's so many interesting things about Doggerland, but this is the theory that actually lots of our areas were geographically stuck together. And so people could freely walk to various areas, and we weren't cut off. England wasn't cut off, or the UK wasn't cut off by the sea. Now, how archaeologists have come up with this idea is because over the time, as you have fishermen or various people, and they trawl the seas, where you can see where it says Doggerland and there's a little circle pointing. As they were trawling the seas, there have been instances where they've trawled up tusks and teeth from saber-toothed tigers, or they've tusks from woolly mammoths, or they've brought up fossilized food or fossilized seeds and things like that. And originally people thought, oh, it's just a bit random, it's obviously just fallen into the sea somehow. But the more that these things have been dragged up from the seabed, the more has led scientists to believe there's almost too much. It can't just be random that people have just thrown a bit of rubbish in the sea hundreds of thousands of years ago. So it's led historians and archaeologists to believe that 16,000 BC, the Earth looked very different, and that actually areas of different countries were all joined together. And so therefore the belief was that as the ice ages thawed, people weren't living in the UK before that point because it was too cold. And so you have most of the prehistoric people kind of situated around areas like Africa. And then they move into Europe and through Europe and eventually into the UK, but they walk there. They don't get a boat, they walk there. And they walk there as the ice ages come to an end and the climate warms up, because before that, it's unlikely that people would want to settle in a place that's incredibly cold. It's harder to survive. And so this is what's led to the theory of Doggerland. And then eventually the sea levels rose as the ice ages thawed, and then it led us, the United Kingdom, to be an island. And so it was around 2.5 million years ago that they think that life began in Africa. And then we spread out over the world. And that lots of the world, as I said, particularly the UK, was joined to Europe. Now, we know these early humans eventually develop into what is known as Homo sapiens, and they eventually come to Britain. They might have visited before, but didn't stay because it was too cold, but eventually they come and they stay. And so this interesting theory about Doggerland, I find absolutely fascinating, this idea that actually this whole area of green was once land, and that underneath the sea, whenever you cross the sea, that actually you're going over land that people once lived on, that was once part of our country, was how we were attached to mainland Europe. And I find it so fascinating. And so, yeah, if you find it interesting, there's so many interesting theories and ideas about Doggerland. So go and check them out. Now, if you've got somebody at home, or you can write it in the chat, so talk to somebody at home or write it in the chat. Can you see this photograph? What do you think this photograph is? What do you think this photograph is? So I could either pop it in the chat, or you could talk to somebody at home, or you could have a little think. What do you think it is? So lots of people thinking that it looks like a footprint. Now, some of you may be thinking that this is a photograph that I'm re-showing you of the footprints that Mary Leakey found. But actually it's not. If you go up to Norfolk, can you see here? There's lots of fossilised material. And there's special footprints that were found fossilised on the beach near to Norfolk in Haysborough. Now, worth going and checking it out if you live nearby, but this is the proof that we have of people coming and settling in Britain, we have these fossilised footprints, these fossilised remains, and they look exactly the same, don't they, as the footprints that Mary Leakey found in Africa. Now, these were found in 2013, and this is been excavated. This is kind of a picture, an illustration of what they looked like. And this is what archaeologists have looked at. They dated them because they're super clever, and they use this as proof that we know that people were inhabiting Britain around 800,000 years ago. And so it's such an interesting, it's a cluster of footprints. Now, because it's a cluster of footprints, all of the footprints are different sizes. And so this suggests to archaeologists that this wasn't just one person, this was a family of people, and that they crossed this area and it was fossilized in the mud, and that this is a whole potential tribe of people that have migrated into Britain. And so people migrate to Britain, people come and settle in Britain, and this period of time we refer to as the Stone Age. But why do you think we call it the Stone Age? I'm going to turn my camera off so you can see this in a bit more detail. Why do you think it's known as the Stone Age? Now, as you can see, there's lots and lots of different types of picture there, isn't there? So on the top left, you can see big boulders. And then in the middle and on the right, you can see some flint that's been shaped. I'm going to look at that a bit next time. But what do you think? It's really not hard, but yeah, loads of you have got it. It's called the Stone Age because it's the time where we start to use tools, and we're using stone tools. And those stone tools can be as simple as, in the top left-hand corner, that big boulder, using that for maybe cracking open nuts or seeds that you may have gathered, all the way to actually sharpening stones like flint to create cutting implements like you can see on the right. And that is really as simple as why we call it the Stone Age. It's called the Stone Age because it's the first time that we have evidence that early humans are using and developing stone tools. So have a look at these stone tools on this picture. What do you think these stone tools are being used for? So we have a big round boulder. We have kind of another stone with like a bit of a pointy tip. We have some other stones that have been kind of tied to sticks. What do you think these tools are used for? So yes, we can see axes and knives. They look like the ones on the right, and an arrow, and maybe the big stones for grinding or crushing. Great ideas. I never know really what the big pointy one is. That's a really interesting one. Some people think it's a piercing. Some archaeologists that have found these tools think it maybe is like a piercing tool. So if you killed an animal, you could use it almost like a cutting tool to kind of cut, because they would have worn skins, so to cut the skin off of the animal. But yeah, there's potentially this could have been a hand axe if it was attached to something. You could have had a handle, or maybe just held it and used it to chop bits of wood. Some archaeologists think they potentially would have had stones that they would have just thrown. So you want to catch a particular animal to eat, because the diet would have predominantly been meat. These are some stones. I'm going to throw them at throw them at the animals in order to try and catch them for my dinner. We obviously have evidence of spear heads. Now, we don't have the handles. Why do you think we don't have the handles? Well, we don't have the handles because the handles would have been made of wood, and so they would have decomposed over the hundreds and thousands of years. But we definitely think that they would have had spears and axes that they probably would have tied on to sticks. This one, potentially a hammer stone to hammer things in. If you've ever made a fence and put a fence post in, you have a special hammer that you hammer the posts into. Well, this potentially was a hammer stone or a grinding stone to grind seeds. But the thought is that this is the first time that we have proof that humans were actually making particular hand stone tools. Now you can see evolution of this. At the beginning, you're just using big stones to bash and throw. And then later on in the Stone Age, you can then see evidence that this changes. And you can see these stones are being sharpened and evidence that they were potentially attached to wooden poles or handles. And so there's definitely an evolution involved. Now, the next thing to think about is that although prehistoric people didn't write anything, they definitely drew things. Now, these are some really famous Stone Age paintings that people from the Stone Age drew. I particularly love the one in the bottom right. Now, if you put your historian hat on, what evidence do you think this gives you about life in the Stone Age? What do you think it tells you? Yeah, there's lots and lots of animals. In fact, you can't really see any evidence of humans, can you? In the top right, it looks like potentially wild sheep or a wild horse. In the top right, you've got cows. In the bottom left, it looks a bit like a bison or something like that. And in the bottom right, it looks like potentially a deer or a pig. It's a bit hard to tell, actually. I think it potentially is a deer, but it's a bit tricky. It could also be a pig because it's got quite a thick neck. What can you learn from this? Well, those of you that are saying you can learn how important hunting was, that would be a judgment you could potentially make, isn't it? Because they are using their time to draw paintings or draw pictures of animals. It shows how important animals were for their survival. And so I think that these are really beautiful, and it helps us to piece together what we know about prehistoric times. And so because we can see these images of horses and deers and pigs and wildebeest and mammoths, we've seen these pictures. They're almost like the photographs of the prehistoric time. They're pictures that people have drawn. And because that's one of the only real evidence that we have of the Stone Age, it gives the judgment, and lots of you have made the same judgment, so well done, that actually the main way that humans survived was by killing and eating animals, because this is what the pictures show us. And you would think that if you were going to draw a picture about what your life was like today and what was important to you today, you would probably pick the most important things. Now, in the Old Stone Age and the Middle Stone Age, so those first two periods of time, people were tended to be nomads. So they're a bit like bee if you're reading How to Skin a Bear. And that means that they migrated, they moved around from place to place, usually following animals. So animals would migrate as well to various places for food or for water. And so it's likely that the Middle and Old Stone Age people would have followed that same path so that they could go where the food was. And so people in these eras were known as nomadic, which means that they moved around. Now, we have very, very little evidence as to what they kind of slept in. Maybe caves, potentially shelters, a bit like historic tents. So it's very hard to tell because, again, we have very little archaeological evidence, because if they were putting up shelters, they would be using wood and they'd be using animal skins. And those things are things that decompose. Although we have little fragments that may have fossilized over time, it's a judgment that we are making that we don't have caves everywhere. So it's likely to shelter that they were making their own shelters. But they would have roamed from place to place and they would have used those animals in order to eat. But they probably would have used those animals for other things. So I'm going to give you another thinking task now. Look at these images. We've got some wild horses, we've got a wild deer and a wild boar. Can you think of at least 3 things that you could have used, or 3 ways you would have used animals in order to help you survive. Because meat is an obvious one, but can you think of anything else? Can you think of any other ways? I'm going to give you 30 seconds. Okay, let's go through some of them. So it definitely would have given them food to eat. So that's an obvious one. So cha-ching, have you got that one correct? They definitely would have predominantly eaten meat. They would have gathered seeds and nuts and berries, but primarily they would have eaten their food, eaten meat for their main source of food. Skins for clothes. So well done if you got that one. So they would have used their skins for clothes and to keep warm, because what other choices would they have had? They don't have any sort of cloth weaving, so they can't weave cloth. That technology hasn't been invented. And so they can't knit a jumper because they don't have that sort of ability yet. We haven't developed that technology. So they're only really, if you want to keep warm, that's your only option. Also, potentially using your skins for shelter. So that's another thing that you would have used the skins for. The other thing that you could have used, which is why there's a big picture of a deer there, is that you could have used their bones or their antlers to make tools. So next week, we're going to look at something incredible that the Stone Age people did using antlers. Because actually, if you think about an antler, it's almost like an axe, isn't it? So you could use their antlers or bones for hammers and tools, and done lots and lots and lots of work using those byproducts. The other thing, which is pretty gruesome to think about, but where your muscles attach to your bones, you obviously have lots of sinews, which are kind of almost like really strong thread. So you could use sinews, the sinews of the animals, if you dried it a bit, you could use those to make a thread to tie bits of wood together, or to fasten your clothes together. So it's pretty gruesome to think about. And also you could use the fat to make oil, and use that as a byproduct as well, potentially to help start fires, or for any other purposes. If you feel like you had maybe dry, if your skin was dry, you could maybe use some of that oil fat. But we don't really know. It's just, again, an assumption that we make because we don't really have any proof. But it definitely would have been a really scary task to hunt in the Stone Age. Things like boars are actually really highly aggressive. And so it was probably very dangerous to hunt. And that's why the life expectancy in this period of time is no more than, say, 20 or 21. That if you got to 21, you were deemed to be really quite old, because it was so dangerous and harsh to survive. Now, in the early Stone Age, they hadn't learned how to even make fire to cook with. And so they would have eaten their meat raw. So very, very similar to kind of other animals in the animal kingdom. But later, they learnt to make fire. And so then that would have helped to have kept them warm. They would have used and understood to use wood and tinder, like dry grass, to get the fire going. And nobody really knows how they worked out how to use fire, but there is some suggestions that fires sometimes occur naturally, don't they? If we have a really dry period of time, or like a really old dry tree gets caught in a cross of lightning and thunder, then they sometimes combust, don't they? So that's maybe where we understood about fire. Or it might have just been fluke of, rubbing a few sticks together, because you worked out it kept you warm, for example, and then worked out that created fire. But again, we don't know. It's quite fascinating, isn't it? But we don't know all these things. Now, the next thing is there's no metal pots, there's no saucepans. So once they've developed fire, how would they have cooked their meat? How would they have cooked it? So they would have decided, oh, well, actually, maybe it's a bit nicer if we cook it. It tastes a bit better. So again, that development, that evolution. But how would they have cooked it? Well, sometimes you still see this for people that eat meat. You sometimes see like a rotisserie, but you would have potentially done it on a spit. So this is known as a spit. So like some branches and then a stick that goes over the top. But also, Stone Age people weren't only hunters, they would have also gathered. So they would have gathered food that grew naturally in the wild. So that's why we tend to refer to them as being nomadic and hunter-gatherers. Okay. So they might have gathered fruit or berries, nuts and seeds, birds' eggs, honey, or maybe even mushrooms. So what I want you to now think about is, if you were going to create a Stone Age survival kit that people in the Stone Age could carry with them, what items would you include? It's a really tricky one, isn't it? What would you include in your Stone Age survival kit? And remember, it can't be technology that hasn't been invented yet. So you can't carry some matches and a woolly jumper made out of wool, because you don't have that. So what would your survival kit include? What do we think? So yeah, some stone tools, so maybe a flint axe, maybe some tinder. So yeah, maybe you'd carry some tinder around so that you could use it to start a fire. Maybe some dried, so if you dried your meat, maybe you could carry some dried meat around with you so that you could survive. But there's lots of things that you might include. You might include some leaves with some sinew string. Maybe if you cut your finger, you could sort of wrap that around it so that it wasn't sore. Maybe you would carry some extra furs around if you got cold. So really, really good one to think about. Maybe talk to people at home as well what they would include, because that's my tasks for you for this week. So what would you include in a Stone Age survival kit? You could even go out and actually make a Stone Age survival kit. Can you find some shaped stones? Can you make your own little axe? Although be careful, I can't take responsibility for anything to do with that. So you need to make sure you have parents' permission and or grown-ups' permission and you're being safe. But you could definitely make your own toolkit, or you could design it and draw it and tell people about it, or you could go and ask other people what they would include. The other thing is there's this after session activity that you could do. It's in the copy either above or below wherever you're watching from, and it's called Surviving the Stone Age. So it shows you a really big picture and it asks you, how would you survive? So where would you set up your camp? And what would you do if you were settling here for a few weeks? How would you survive? So that is your activities should you wish to develop it. Don't forget also, you can go and find out lots and lots about Doggerland, because I really find that interesting. So that's the end of the session. A really nice thought process, a really nice introduction. Thank you so much to everybody who has contributed. And next week, we're going to develop that further. We're going to look at how people in the Stone Age evolved, a little bit more about how they survived, and what day-to-day life would have been like for people in the Stone Age. But I hope that you've learned lots. Don't forget to share any activities that you do over in the Facebook group, because we love to see it. And I will see you next week.